Hello, my name's Sue Wright and I'm a Professor of Accounting in the UTS Business School. Last November, with my colleague Associate Professor Helen Spiropoulos, I hosted a panel session on women on corporate boards. Before I introduce the topic and the speakers of that panel session, I'd like to, on behalf of the UTS Business School, respectfully acknowledge that we are located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, a people who have cared for their community, land and waters for thousands of generations, based on their deep knowledge of country. And on behalf of the Business School, we pay our respects to their ancestors and elders and acknowledge their ongoing status as First Peoples of this land. The topic of the panel session last November is Women on Corporate Boards, and Helen and I were joined by Eileen Doyle, Vivian Quinn and Jane Bridge, three amazing and generous women who shared their experience and their advice to those interested in this topic. And some of those present and listening today are probably also interested in getting onto a corporate board themselves, and they also provided a bit of frank advice as to the advantages, methods and downfalls of aspiring to being a company director. So with each speaker, I started by introducing them and then asked them to make some introductory comments about their views on corporate boards. I'll start with Eileen Doyle. Dr. Eileen Doyle has a PhD in Applied Statistics from the University of Newcastle. She was Australia's first Fulbright Scholar in Business Management, where she attended a Columbia University in New York in 1993. She's also written 2 books based on her business experience, designed to share her knowledge with others who aspire to a similar pathway. One book was called Back to Business Basics, 6 Useful Toolkits for Small and Medium Enterprises, and another, Call a Business Angel. Aileen's had an exceptional career facilitating and enabling the commercialisation of innovation in large companies, in SMEs and startups for more than 3 decades. Aileen's had executive and board level roles in a number of very large companies in Australia. At present, she is a director of Santos, DBI, NextDC, Air Services Australia, Kinetic Group and Swoop Analytics. She's also had experience with CSIRO, Boral, the Newcastle Port Corporation, State Super Financial Services and the Knights Rugby League Club. An amazing base on which to provide comments and advice, as she did in our panel session last year. Elaine started her address by describing the role of the board and its responsibility to focus on long-term shareholder value, and she returned to this theme frequently in her comments. She introduced the role of the board in terms of its focus on long-term shareholder value, and then talked about the board as needing to be an effective team. She considered that the ideal size of the board was 6 to 8 people, and she indicated that the role of a director and the responsibility of a director is to understand their role and the industry, to stay up to date, and to be an effective networker. She felt that the value of diversity was in aiding the very best discussion and decision making through the diversity of thought and the diversity of skills that each director brings to the board. And she felt it was best when a board cast a wide net in terms of looking for directors. She quipped that the role of the board really was to provide a wise old head for the CEO so that they could draw on experience in their decision making. We'll now return to Aileen's comments when she's discussing the scrutiny and pressures of being a director.
And so the scrutiny on being a public listed company director over the 20 years I've been involved has just grown exponentially. In terms of government boards, I think, again, your obligation's the same. Most government boards where it's a corporation actually have their own act, that particular organisation. So CSIRO had its own act, Air Services Australia has its own act. And your role as a director is actually to comply with that act in the interest, again, in the long-term interest of the organisation. So where you get yourself into trouble is where the short-term interests of the minister, who's the shareholder minister, doesn't quite align with that. And sadly, I've had a few of those as well. But that's, it's a different emphasis. In terms of private boards, your worst nightmare in a private board, which might have a couple of private shareholders, is if the shareholders aren't aligned, because it nearly stagnates decision-making. And so in a private board, generally things move faster, good decisions are made. You don't quite have the public profile of a public listed board, but you can still get yourself into trouble depending on alignment of shareholders. So I hope that's just given you a bit of an introduction, and I'm sure the other speakers will talk in more detail about some other aspects of being a board director. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eileen. I really appreciate that. I apologise for the flashing up on your screen. That was us just remembering that we were going to be recording what was being said. So unfortunately, we missed the beginning of what you were saying. We'll hand over as soon as I work out which screen to get to. Back to the gallery screen. Yes. No, not that one. We'll hand over to Vivian Quinn, who's going to be our next speaker. Let me just give Vivian a short introduction. The focus is still on.
Do you want to share? Do you want to put this slide?
Yes, I do actually. I'm going to let Roman.
You should take the mic and I'll fix this. So.
I'll just, yeah. Do you want this slide? Yes, I will. I'll introduce you. So for those in the room who are the more important of our participants that I can actually see, for those online, I hope you can see me, but perhaps you can hear me. I'm now introducing Vivian Quinn, who's our second speaker. Vivian's also got a CV that is most enviable and really places her in a unique position to address us today. Vivian's been associated with UTS for many years and has been a wonderful participant in many student as well as business-related activities. But her main occupation is as an experienced CFO director and a chair of audit and risk committees. She's currently working as a non-executive director, providing advisory services in risk, governance, strategic planning, cash flow forecasting, board reporting and management performance. She's mostly been associated with blue chip organisations across multiple industries and multiple areas, always focusing on strategy to deliver and exceed expectations. She's worked for companies such as IBM and Johnson & Johnson. She's worked for O'Brien Glass, Australian Hearing and Canon Australia, just to mention a couple that I have in front of me here. So Vivian, we look forward to your comments as well, and I will try and drive the slides at the right time.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Great. So what I'm going to be doing here is building on what Eileen has been talking about. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my story. So this is my personal story of how I migrated or transitioned from an executive to a director, because I thought that was most relevant for today. So I think my story starts off with I have been extremely lucky having a wonderful and very extensive executive career. And rather than specialising in any one industry, I've been able to successfully transfer my skill set to many different industries. And I think what Eileen mentioned in her talk was it's important to take that time when you move into a new industry to understand how it works, to understand the business models and understand the mechanics of that industry. But the beauty of having a finance background means that actually you're able to do that. So that's been a blessing. I remember at one time, so just to summarise, I've had a long career in finance. The last 12 years or so, I was a CFO of various organisations. And I remember at one time I had 2 offers on the table for another CFO role. And I was seeking some guidance from a consultant at Egon Zehnder who I'd built a relationship with. And he knew that my longer term plan was to become a board director. And what he said to me was that if I want to become a board director, then I need to build my breadth and depth of experience So in other words, don't continue to take roles where you can do the role with your eyes shut. You've been a CFO in a particular industry, take a different industry, take this, take that. As a result of that conversation, I actually took a role in a federal government agency, which I had never ever done before because I was always in private enterprise. And that was really interesting, working for a federal government agency as its CFO, particularly because it was to privatise as well. But it turned out that it wasn't too dissimilar to some of my previous employers because I'd worked for the likes of IBM and Johnson & Johnson for many years. So there isn't a lot of difference between the federal government and those multinationals. The thing is, with having worked, or at least the first 20 odd years of my career working for IBM and Johnson & Johnson, you get exposed to leading practice, which is fantastic. But one of the downfalls from a CFO's perspective is you don't get to build your treasury skills because large multinationals like IBM and Johnson & Johnson have intercompany lending, and they're going to be at much better rates than any local bank. So knowing that I was missing that part of my knowledge, I went out and I sought to undertake a Master of Applied Finance to round out that skill set that I wasn't going to be getting in my current role. And that really helped me because, you know, things with funding structures and so forth, I felt was important. And I didn't always want to work for a multinational. I really wanted to work for a private equity backed firm. So shortly after completing the Masters, I actually did work for a private equity backed firm, and that was really, really interesting. Excuse me. So my point is, it's important to get the breadth and the depth of the skills that as much as you can during your executive career, so that when you become a non-executive director, you're able to draw on those skills. I think that's the thing. And one of the other things I used to do was seek out challenge. I liked working for organisations that were very complex in challenging circumstances, because when you've had a career for a long time and you're really good at what you do, and I don't mean that as in any other way other than what it was, you look for challenge. You need challenge. So doing that is also puts you in a good stead in terms of your longer perspective. I was always thinking about the longer game. When you're a CFO and you've been a CFO for quite a while, what you're doing is you're being a CFO, which is great, but you're also thinking about what next. Everyone does. And for me, it wasn't about becoming a CEO. I did not want to follow that path. I wanted to be a non-executive director. I was really clear, probably in the last 5 to 10 years of my executive career, that that's what I wanted. I also wanted to give back. So knowing that my executive career was just about to come to an end, I was bringing it to an end after about 30 odd years. I also wanted to give back. And just as a short story that I will share with you, my husband's sister has Down syndrome, and she was cared for by an organisation called Sunnyfield, which is a very large organisation, but a very caring organisation for the intellectually disabled. And they looked after her for 30-something years. And my husband and I used to go there on a weekend and bring Jane out for time at home and things like that. But I was always impressed by the staff there, of what a wonderful job they did looking after Jane and her colleagues. So when it came my turn to give back, my first choice was, of course, Sunnyfield, because I was so impressed by the organisation. And in addition to that, I was super impressed by their board. Their board were outstanding, you know, people, yeah, really, really impressive. So I really wanted to, I just finished my executive career and I really wanted to join that board, and I thought it was going to be quite difficult because of the superstars that were on that board at the time. But what I had to do at the time was I had to modify my executive CV to turn it into a board CV, which is like a different animal altogether. And when you've been an executive for decades, you actually don't know what a board CV looks like. So that was a bit of a journey for me, and I've had a few iterations of what that looks like, but I thought I would share that with you today. But what I basically did is prepared the board CV and then wrote a covering letter as to why I wanted to join that board. And luckily I went through the whole process and the board did agree, which was great. But I think my point is the exec CV has to be turned into a board CV, and the covering letter needs to be really crystal clear about why you're choosing that organisation to put your name down. And there's a whole, we could talk for another couple of hours on just that topic, I think. But anyway, that was my story. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a couple of slides where I have put some bullet points down on what board CVs might look like. And I've got Jane sitting next to me, who's an expert in this area, and I'm sure she can comment anytime. But there's a few different versions. The first version I'm showing here, version 1, is maybe 3, maximum 4 pages. And it's obviously you can read what's on it, name, current roles, etc. Key skills are just listed, that's all. And the profile, your profile, that's the profile about who you are. And the profile has to be geared towards the role that you're seeking. Because if you think about it, as humans, we've got multiple skills and multiple talents. But what you need to do is think about the organisation that you would like to join their board, and what about you is it that makes you special and unique to bring to their board. And so that profile needs to be geared towards that. Then personal and professional attributes. So a short paragraph on maybe your top 3 or 4 only. And I know you might have 8 or 9, but just the top 3 or 4, that's all that you should be there. Where you win points on these CVs, I do believe, is on being succinct and not being verbose. Nobody wants to sit there for pages, they won't read it. So in my case, for the personal and professional attributes, I would list leadership, strategy, M&A, negotiation skills, broad functional skills, whatever. And each person is different. And again, it really depends on the role that you're going for. List any previous directorships. And then I've put in bold there. Then your exec career in summary. And by summary, I mean absolute summary. I think, would you agree, Jane? Absolutely. Yeah. So, this is a board role you're going for. It's not an exec role. So it's a different approach. So that's one example of what you could do. I think I've put a second one in there. So this one again, no more than 4 pages. 3 is even better if you can do it. Name and contact, your board and executive success. So this top paragraph here is your dot points with your quantifiable successes. And it's really important throughout your career, and I learnt to do this over time, particularly when I was a CFO, is you'd be working on various projects, various initiatives, you'd be developing strategy, you'd be doing this, that and the other, but keeping a record of what savings you contributed or what additional revenue you enable the organisation to achieve through pricing or through this or whatever. But just keeping a list of your major achievements and quantifying them is really important, because it says who you are and what you contributed at the time, and no waffle. The list of executive and non-executive board experience. So while I was a CFO, I was also on some boards, so just put that in as well. And again, in bold, in case you missed it last time, executive experience summarised, really, really summarised. And it's hard. I mean, for someone like me who's got decades of executive experience, you want to talk about it, but no, that's not what you're here for. You're here to be a board member now. So that needs to be the focus. Your educational and professional development, and anything else you'd like to add about yourself. In my case, I would talk about the fact that I loved mentoring students at UTS for many years, things like that, which is good. Then the last one is a more recent iteration of the CV that some of my colleagues and I have been seeing, and that's the one-pager for a board role. And I really like the one-pager. I don't know how everyone feels about that, but the one-pager is a lot harder to do, because, I mean, you remember the old Mark Twain saying, you know, sorry, I didn't write a short summary. I didn't have time, so here's a long one, right? So to do a short one-page version is actually a lot more difficult, and it needs to be punchy. So the qualifications and contact can be down on the left-hand side or wherever. The first section of words is to do with your pitch, and I'm going to talk about your pitch in a minute. But it is important, if you want a board role, to develop your pitch. And, you know, you never know when the opportunity will arise, you know, but people talk about the elevator pitch, the 30-second, the 60-second, whatever. You've got to be ready, because in these networking opportunities that you get from time to time, it's an opportunity to sell yourself. And I think that's really important for females. I think, you know, I guess it's the gender thing coming out, but for females, sometimes it doesn't come naturally, and you need to work on that skill and you need to bring it out, because otherwise the role might go to someone else. So to sell yourself, we'll talk about the pitch in a minute. Also, the background and experience, similar to one of the other CVs, just find the top 3 strengths that you've got. I know you've got a lot, but just focus on the most marketable and the ones that you are the best at, and focus on those. And maybe if you can bring an example in of what you've done with that, it would be helpful. And then the positions that you've held, just list them, and then anything else you want to put down the bottom on professional activities. Again, you know, I would be putting my association with UTS for such a long time. But that one pager is punchy. And if they want more information, you can then give the 3-pager if you like, but at least it's a foot in the door. On the pitch. So the pitch, as I said, you need 2 pitches, a shorter one and a longer one. You have to think about your personal brand. So when you've been out in the workforce for a while, you've developed a personal brand, and that might be a piece of work that you need to do separate to, you know, preparing your CV and all the rest of it. You need to be clear about who you are. And why you need to be clear about that is you've got to think about what you're actually bringing to the table. And if you're not clear about who you are and what you're bringing, it's actually unlikely that you'll get a role, right? So really, really clear background, skills, experience bundled up into this personality, which is who you are. And what does that represent, and what does that look like? And that goes in the pitch, and it's got to be compelling. So I hope you find that helpful, because that's an important part of that last 1-pager that I just showed you. Yeah. So, right. So that's pretty much all I was going to share with you on the CVs and the pitch. I'll just talk another minute about my directorship that I've currently got at Sunnyfield. And going back to that, so they accepted me based on my cover letter, which was compelling. Obviously, I've got an emotional attachment to Sunnyfield, so that was great. And the skill sets that I brought were what they were looking for. And so the Sunnyfield board follows the proper skills matrix model of understanding the skills of each director. And when they are looking for a director and they're briefing an agency or whatever, they're very, very clear about the skill sets they're after. And I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, so I was lucky. But back to my directorship at Sunnyfield, I think almost immediately I was asked to join the Audit, Finance and Risk Committee because of my background. And then within a year, I was appointed its chair. And again, because of my prior experience with property when I was a CFO, they asked me to join the property committee as well. And there's a fellow called Tom Pocket, who's the current chair of IAGN Stockland, who was also on the board at the time. He asked me to become a director of Gateway. So Gateway is a community housing provider, and he was the chair, and he asked me to join that board. So I did, which was great. But Tom's workload got pretty hectic. And so then he asked me if I would then become the chair of that Gateway board, which was probably within about a year of joining the board. So I became the chair of Gateway, which I really, really enjoy. And I have been doing that, but I have stepped down from being the chair of the Audit, Finance and Risk Committee because What I can tell you is that when you're the chair of an organisation, it's a lot more time consuming than when you're just a director, okay? So one of the other things to watch out for is how much time you have available and how much time you can give to these organisations, yeah? And you want to do a thorough job, so you don't want to overcommit. Anyway, what I'm finding with these choices that I've made is that it's very, very time consuming, but also very rewarding. And it's almost as if the first 30 odd years of my career has been for a purpose, and that's to build the skills and expertise that I am now using as a director. And I think the other point to mention is being a director, which I'm pretty sure Eileen also mentioned, is it's not the same as being an executive. So being a director is working on the business, like in the parapet. It's not working in the business. Management are in the business, the board are on the business. And there's a very distinct distinction there, which is important for boards to remember, and particularly directors on boards. And I think I've come full circle because as chair of Gateway, I realised I needed to supplement my skill sets on that board that had been in existence for about 8 years. And we had terrific skills to take us from inception to where we were, but we were missing the skill sets to bring us into the future now that we were clear on where we were heading. So we're doing some fairly large developments. So I went out and I sought people with the appropriate experience, and I was extremely lucky to convince 2 fellows to join. One is a property expert with wonderful, wonderful experience, and then the other one is an infrastructure expert. And both of them bring wonderful experience. The one with the infrastructure experience had always wanted to work in community housing because that was going to be his way of giving back. And so it's amazing how you can find really talented people to come and help organisations like that and get a lot of joy from it. And I think I'll finish off on one point. So Gateway's going really, really well. And I'm still on the Sunnyfield board and just got re-elected again. But one of the issues we're facing with Sunnyfield is diversity. So I think Eileen spoke about diversity at the thought level. And what we're saying is we're exploring more ways at Sunnyfield to be more inclusive in our governance, which is actually really tricky because Sunnyfield's mission is to provide for the intellectually disabled to enrich the quality of life in all facets, so shared living, employment, community services, etc. But it is a very hard thing when you're talking about having an intellectually disabled member on the board. So we've just appointed someone in charge of inclusive governance, and we're making sure that when we bring anyone into the boardroom with us, that that person is going to feel very supported. So we're paving the way there right now. I should also just mention diversity and everything else we pretty much already have, and it is a really important point. You know, you don't want 35-year-old white males all sitting in a room making decisions, and the same for females, by the way. You know, the diversity really helps the thinking and the quality of the decisions. So that's pretty much all I had to say, and I'm going to hand to Sue.
Thanks so much, Vivian. Yes, you'll be handing to Jane in just a moment, but I thought I'd introduce her first. So our final speaker has been partly introduced to you already by the other panellists because of her expertise. Jane has a different expertise to the other 2 panellists. She's actually worked in board advisory and board search consulting over many years. She has led over 200 board reviews, and she's appointed over 300 of the region's most influential chairs and non-executive directors. She set up her own organisation to do this, Boardroom Partners, if I've got that detail correct, which she's more recently sold her business but continues to work in the area. So she's got really deep experience in how to get the best people onto boards, and if you are that best person, how to put yourself forward to be on a board. Jane is listed as her CV that I've picked up said that she's fascinated by the human elements of governance and the difference that can be made by active, and effective board members. And so I think that really underlines the need to get the right people in the room. And you might be interested to know as well that in 2003, she was awarded a Centenary Medal for her contribution to society in business leadership. So it's wonderful that your work has been recognised, but we look forward to hearing from you, Jane.
Thank you. And I also endorse my acknowledgement of the people of the Eora Nation Gadigal and your UTS acknowledgement. Thanks. And thanks also to our previous speakers. What does it leave me to say? I actually thought I'd just give you a very, very quick summary of, I've worked with boards in Australia, New Zealand, across Asia, a little bit, mainly Australia, for just over 25 years now. So this is the end of my career. And I would have to say I've seen enormous changes. And maybe 18 years ago, I did some research on the top 500 listed companies in Australia to look at how many women were on those boards. And 18, might be 20 years ago actually, and there were 3.7% of board directors were female. And I made a bit of a song and dance about it at the time. I used to keep newspaper clippings about it, but they've all got a bit dog-eared and yellow, and I think I've thrown them out. But I guess it was sort of starting that whole movement and awareness. And the little bit that didn't come up in my background is I actually had worked in industry, and then I went to work in government. And when I worked in government, I was just amazed at how many boards the state government had. And I had 3,500 boards in New South Wales, and nobody really knew how people got on those boards, let alone how on earth do you get anyone off them. Yeah. And it just triggered something for me about, I was the director of personnel policy, it used to be called in those days, for the state government. And it started me on a project of let's think about board recruitment, board assessment, board renewal, about tenure and guidelines for limits, about who gets paid and who doesn't. Well, of course, I could have made it a 20-year job, but in actual fact, I went on to run a department on women's policy and lost my head in a state election when the government changed. And at that point, somebody asked me to go and work with him. And it was the only board specialist advisory company in Australia. And it was run by a guy in his late 70s who'd set up a not-for-profit business, who felt so strongly about how people, same issues, how did people get onto corporate boards and how do you get them off? And what do you do with people who really shouldn't be there? And when I went to work for him, there were lots of references in his files about the OBN, and I had to ask him, what is that? And he said, it's the Old Boys Network. And it was, so we're talking a long time ago, but it was a general recognition that there's got to be a better way of doing this. So I do think we've come a long way, but I think we've got an awfully long way to go. And when I look at some very high profile corporate boards that have been in the paper in the last 3 weeks, and I look at the people on those boards and I think, how did they get there? And I don't know if you do anything about sociograms or spidergrams and connections and who knows who. I mean, these are just rife on some of our biggest listed company boards. So, however, I think the introductions of skills matrices and tenure for boards, there are now the AICD, which is the Professional Association in Australia for Company Directors, has balked at introducing or mandating guidelines, but there's a general acceptance for the majority of boards now that directors should be appointed for a specified term. And that term is often 3 years. It can be more, it can be less. And there's a general acceptance that once you've been on and renewed with shareholder approval, as Eileen commented, 2 or 3 times, that's probably enough. Yeah. Because you're there as an independent director, and this is really important. A non-executive director doesn't work in the business. They shouldn't have an office in the business. They're not there every day. If a board meets 10 times a year for half a day, we would generally say you need to triple that. You know, you need to actually say, well, I need half a day. So for every half day, you probably need, you know, 3 times that, 1.5 days a month, not half a day, because you need to read, you need to follow up, you need to be on committees. So if a board says, oh, it's only about 12 days a year, you probably need about 36 days a year. And that's the reality of it. And you know, be aware of that. So I think the business I worked for was trading as a not-for-profit because it was seen as a community good, an educational facility. It ran across Australia. It was very small, but it was sponsored by 20 of the top ASX companies. And it was a very interesting experience for me to work in a not-for-profit, but it wasn't viable because we wanted to scale it and really have much more impact. So we moved it into being a commercial organisation, which is an interesting transition. And got it sort of humming a bit. And my wonderful 80-year-old man by then decided it was time to sell it and sold it to a group who wanted to just make it into another headhunting firm and wouldn't sell it to me, ironically, because he said he didn't think Australia was quite ready for a business like this to be run by a woman. So beautifully, we just recruited somebody who was the Prudential's investment management, and he said to me, look, if you want to go off and start a business, I'll come and work with you. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And so that's how I come to be doing what I'm doing. And over that time, as Sue said, I would have worked with probably about 400 boards of all shapes and sizes and stages of maturity. And they're all wildly different. They all think they're not like anybody else, but they all have things in common. So I thought I'd just talk briefly about what boards tend to look for in a very generic way, which will reinforce some of Eileen's comments and many of Vivian's. So what boards look for and how you might go about making sure that, you know, you're in the game. But I also thought I'd spend just a couple of minutes talking about how boards find directors, because again, you've heard Vivian talk about her board career and board trajectory. So it's sort of quite personally initiated, and then contacts and connections who see that she's a good director, so they ask her to be on other boards. So the board world in Australia is expanding. It's very interesting. The supply of directors still far exceeds the demand for directors. For every director role, when I was working full-time in this area, I would have had 20 aspiring directors. So you're not alone. You know, there's lots of competition. There's no excuse for underperforming boards. And yet I still know of boards who say, we'd love to appoint a so-and-so, but we just can't find one. I think, well, you just haven't looked. Yeah. So there's, you know, it's a really interesting and changing world, and things are improving. So in terms of how boards find directors, I've written a list. My top one is that they're already known to the board. Okay, that the board knows them from somewhere. There may have been a McKinsey partner who does their strategy advice. They might come and talk to them, or it might just be somebody they play golf with, quite simply. Okay, so it's somebody that the board knows. They're referred on to the board by a colleague or a friend. So it might be with a private business. It might be an accounting firm who says, look, if you're looking to list or raise a bit of money, I know somebody who can do that. And they'll take advice from their legal advisors or from their accountants. They're recommended by shareholders or advisors. So we're seeing quite a bit of that recently, you know, with shareholder activisms increasing in Australia. So you are seeing groups of shareholders saying, get that person off, and he's who we want on. The whole AGL debacle, you know, transition, however you want to call it, is a really great example of that, you know, with influential shareholders saying not good enough, you know, just get that change. And we're going to see more of that, not less. You know, that will continue, and as it should, in my view. It could be via a register or a professional association. So governments keep registers, a professional association, some of the legal and accounting firms keep registers of people who are suitable or interested directors. Women on boards has had a big impact. Women on boards started, I remember when they began, and they've actually grown and been quite impactful in what they do in terms of promoting gender diversity. but there are still many, many dimensions of diversity that are just probably less than that 3.7%, which is where I began. They can be that they're elected via a membership, depending on the sort of organisation we're talking about. So if it's a superannuation fund, for instance, you know, those boards are still made up of half employer and half employee reps. And so elections are there. I'm working with a board at the moment, an irrigator in the Southwest. It's a private company, but their constitution requires that the members, shareholders, who are the irrigators, farmers in the area, have a say in who gets onto the board. So some of them, you know, will nominate one another, and there'll be an election process to get people onto the board. So there are all sorts of different ways that people can get on. Occasionally you'll see a board advertising for people, sometimes that to apply directly. So if you are interested in joining a board, do keep your eye on things. I have found, back to Vivian's one-pager, that LinkedIn isn't a great vehicle for board recruitment, and it's not a useful channel in my view. And many serious directors who I work with have removed their profiles from LinkedIn because they actually find they get too much nuisance mail or too many people reaching out to them. So I wouldn't be advocating that that's where you would search, but you know, the paper. Not physical paper, but the media is, you know, is quite a good place to keep looking. A professional search and recruitment, and that's me, and I'm way down in the list. Okay, so I work for a firm that does actually have a board practice where we work with boards to find directors, but we wouldn't be the first port of call. Our business has grown over the years, and as long as I've been working in it, if I work with one board and we get a great result, I'll work with another board. Somebody on that board says, oh, well, you know, it wasn't too bad, and we did actually find somebody very good and somebody we didn't know. So, you know, there is still opportunity for new people who are unknown to the existing directors to join boards and have an impact. So I endorse what both of our previous speakers have said about diversity, but would caution you about, you know, or joining a board as a token diverse person. And we see a lot of that, and it's very difficult. So whether it's, you know, having a singleton female director on a board of blokes, or having one person with a culturally or linguistically different background, it's very difficult if you've gone in there and there's any aspect of sort of tokenism. So don't let your interest in joining a board overtake or tip the balance on, can I be heard on this board? Why do you want me? How will I make a difference? And how will I know I'm doing a good job? And you're not waiting for 3 years' time when they tap you on the shoulder and they say, you know, thanks very much and goodbye. So the diversity challenge, I think, for boards is very real. Some of the criteria that we're being asked for regularly at the moment are about youth. So don't feel you have to do this when it's a retirement job. It's not. We've appointed many young directors to boards in the last 5 years, and the lived experience that Vivian's talking about is becoming more prominent and more important, particularly in the not-for-profit sector. You know, where people who can relate to and can bring really lived experience is very relevant, very useful. So what do boards look for? I'll just try and be quick. In terms of skills and capabilities, you'll all be well placed here, because I think the first that most boards I've ever worked with look for is financial literacy. So if you can't read a balance sheet, you can't look at a P&L and look where the gaps are and the holes, you know, you're not going to get to first base. Second is industry knowledge. They don't necessarily want every board to have come from that industry, but the Qantas example for me is an absolutely classic example of a board where there's only one recent appointment of somebody to that board who'd ever worked in an airline, and it was a complete dog of an airline, I'll say. You might edit that out. Anyway. particular skills and experience, and they'll usually specify those, because a board is a jigsaw and it needs people with different outlooks, different, the cognitive diversity on a board is critical. People who think differently and they're not all looking at the world through the same lens. I think having a strategic outlook and not being down in the weeds is very important. Going onto a board, if what you really only want to do is ever crawl through a P&L, is not going to serve a board well. Boards are there to guide and steer an organisation. They're not there to micromanage a CEO and a management team. That's management's job. And the other thing that I must that is inherent in any search we would run would be what I just loosely call currency. So, yes, I take Vivian's point, do write down everywhere you've been and everything you've done, but don't draw on some manufacturing company that you did as a new graduate and you're now, 55 and say, oh no, I understand that. You need to be current with what you're talking about. And so if you say you understand an industry, you need to be able to talk about that industry, about the regulatory environment, about who the key players are, about what the challenges are in the industry. We have a lot of people who come to us who'd like to be on boards from accounting or legal or consulting firms who say that they understand all industries. Well, they do at a very superficial level, and sometimes a board will want somebody like that who can look across industries, but also having some industry expertise is quite useful too. So balancing it out. Some of the other criteria that boards are interested in are just having recent and relevant connections. So they want to know, who do you know and who can you put in touch with us for the benefit of this business? Broad organizational knowledge. So if you've run your own business for 5 years, and we've had 20 staff, it's doubtful that BHP are really going to be interested in you. If you've come out of an international organization like Vivian has, it's not always a natural fit for some little startup who's looking to raise money with a private equity background and who's got 3 people. Wouldn't necessarily want Vivian, So it's about, there are some of those balancing acts that you need to do. You need to be smart about where would I fit and what could I bring. A good understanding of the commercial operations and business principles. So you have to understand, when you go and talk to any board or you look at any business, how does this business make money? Or how does this business provide services to its clients? Or how does it deal with its whatever it exists? You have to be really clear on, how does it do that? And why does it survive? And what have I done that might be relevant for that? Having a strong track record and reputation is really important, so that people can look you up, because there'll be a lot of informal and formal reference checking before you get appointed to a board. And the whole compatibility thing, which is another one of those conundrums, because they want you to be compatible and be able to talk with and get on with other people on the board, but they also want diversity. And that's a really hard balance sometimes. We want somebody who's really different, and that requires a very good chair. So my advice to you, if you were talking about joining a board, would be checking who else is on the board. And you're not applying for a job. It's so different. You are looking at a board and as a group of people and deciding, would I want to be associated with them? Would I hang my hat with them? If this went down, would I be happy to go down and sink with them? Am I happy to lose my reputation with these people? Because these are all very relevant considerations, rather than thinking, oh, that looks big and somebody very famous there, I'd love to be on that. I guess my one bit of advice for women, particularly having interviewed thousands of women over the years who'd like to be on boards, and so many of them tell me why they'd like to be on a board in terms of what they could learn. I think, you know what? The board doesn't really want to hear that. They want to know what you're bringing, whether it's connections, credibility, or the board experience, particular experience. They don't want to know why you would love to be associated with them. And so that's just something, and it comes back to Vivian's, what are your experiences, what have you done, and the whole thing about having connections that are close, but being aware that there are very real issues with conflicts on boards. So if you're working in an organization that you want to be on a board that's very relevant or very close to that, it's probably not going to be a good fit. You need to be you need to be able to be independent and justify your independence and not have anybody cross that you're joining this because it's too close for comfort. And there are still many, many examples of that around in our public and private and even government boards, where you're seeing all these ex-politicians appointed. Okay, so 3 things. I've got lots of notes, but I need to stop. So 3 things. I think there are 3 ways you can make a contribution to a board, and everything fits within those. So I think you either, you're contributing around the governance of a board, and you can play that quite strongly. So you can say, look, I understand risk, strategy, stakeholder relations. I've got other board experience. So it's all of that bag of experience and skills that you get from either the AICD course, other boards. The Governance Institute also exists and runs a really good course as well, which is, it's similar but slightly different in its tone, but has the same standing in boardrooms and would give you the same sort of ticket and credibility. So that whole governance piece. Many boards are afraid of governance experts because they see it as kind of bureaucratic. And yes, they do need that, but they don't want people coming on there who are going to be telling them about I-dotting and T-crossing all the time if there's some entrepreneurial small company. But that said, governance is very real. It's here to stay. Its demands of governance are only going to get larger. Secondly is the whole business knowledge and experience. So what have you actually done? Have you grown a business? What sort of things have you done in business? So that would include your own background, your own experience, and the sort of connections that you've got and could bring to that board for its benefit. So it's about where have you been? And then the third is, which is quite critical and worth mentioning, is the whole behavior and style aspects of you and your contribution. So, how do you communicate? Are you actually available enough? And that comes back to the time thing. Prepare. Have you got an encouraging style, or are you going to sort of send shivers down the management team when they see you approaching? Oh no, what are they going to ask this time? Because the board's role is to hold management's toes to the fire, but in the nicest possible constructive way, not to be demanding and jumping on them from a great height. And learning about working in a team so that, there is... as I say, you all know there is no I in team, but boards are collegiate. They must. That doesn't mean they all think the same way, but once they make a decision, it's a unilateral. It's absolutely there's no squibbing out and saying, well, 7 of them thought that, but I didn't agree. Once a board makes a decision, it has to be unanimous. And if it can't be unanimous, you need to rethink your position on the board if it happens regularly and often. So that's my 3 ideas, and I'll stop there because we're over time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jane. I'll try and move to another microphone. So I'm taking the microphones away from the industry panellists that we've got. And as we're moving to a time of questions, I'll just give those in the room and perhaps those on Zoom a few minutes if they've got questions that they'd like to ask. I just thought I might give our panellists an opportunity to perhaps comment on what the others said or contradict or expand. I don't know if, Eileen, you spoke first and you've been quietly listening for a while, if you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, look, I'm very supportive of the comments that the other 2 speakers made. I think in terms of company directors, certainly on the larger companies, your typical term is 3 or 4 terms. That's 9 to 12 years. On all of the boards that I've been on them for 10 years because I feel that I make a commitment to the long-term strategy of that company, and you've got to see it out. And remembering that the average chief executive in Australia only lasts for 4.5 years, to some extent, you're the corporate knowledge of the organisation at that very senior strategic level. So I actually think it's important to make a commitment, a longer-term commitment. The boards where I've spent less than that time is usually because of mergers and acquisitions or some sort of change in circumstances like that. So I personally believe being a director on a company is a long-term commitment. I think that's probably one of the main comments that I would make.
Thanks for that. I'll hand over to Helen now and let her take care with the Q&A. Thanks very much, Helen.
No, thanks, Sue. So while everyone's thinking of a question, as the researcher on the panel, I have several. So many things that you said fascinated me because I've seen it either in research I've done since 2010 or in other people's research. So I guess I'll begin with one question. Recently, a few years ago, we did a paper that found in terms of M&As, we found that boards that are diverse in terms of gender were more likely to select a target that had a gender diverse board, and boards that were all male preferred all male targets. And this was in the Australian setting. So the question I had for you was, how does having more women on a board change its dynamic, and how much does culture have a part in that?
Well,
Yeah.
So I can start, but then I wouldn't mind handing over. Gender diversity is important. And when Jane was talking before about tokenism, it reminded me of a board that I was on a long time ago. And that board did have a token registered nurse on the board, and the rest were all business people. And I know that the registered nurse struggled with the financials and things. So I think what Jane is saying is right. When it comes to diversity of thought is really, really important, but not the tokenism. That just detracts from the whole thing. In terms of the gender of the board, it's interesting that research that you mentioned. I'm not sure how important the gender is versus the culture, because the culture is so important. I'm not qualified to say which is more important, but I can imagine that culture would be as important as the gender. I'll hand to Jane.
Yeah, thanks. Look, a couple of quick comments. I guess when you have an all-male board or an all-female board, that's a very strong message about the culture anyway. It's like a red, it's out there, isn't it? And I think with the M&A research is quite interesting. You've got to ask, because Australia still has the most massively highly gender segregated workforce in all of the OECD countries, and so you've got to say, well, if this was a mining company and they were looking to take over another mining company, it's quite likely that they're all boys around one board and they're all boys around the one they want to take over. And if this was an arts organization or something in the health area, probably have got preponderance of women around the board, and they're looking for another one or do this. So I guess there's that, which it wouldn't necessarily come through in the research. But I've heard so many positive stories about improving and expanding diversity on boards now, that I was always an advocate and always a big fan of diversity, even more so. I think the thing that we overlook, though, is the criticality of having a competent chair who can actually elicit contributions from really diverse people, because I've put numbers of people with very diverse backgrounds onto boards and then had the chair say to me, well, they've been a bit of a disappointment. Or I've had the director come to me and say, I'm not quite sure why they appointed me. It's really difficult for me to get a word in. And so, once you start playing with the makeup of boards and looking to shift the composition, other things have to change too. And the whole process of decision-making needs to be designed so that you can hear diverse voices. Because I guess we're hearing in organizational terms now much more about inclusion. Diversity in terms of changing the numbers is easy, but are those people included in the organization? Are their voices heard? Are they making a difference overall to the organization? Or does it just make the stats look better? So,
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Oh, thank you. I have two, if I may. The first, I guess, building on that latter point. So how might one get a sense of board culture prior to joining, notwithstanding the ability to kind of look up on a website and see what the makeup of that board is, but from a sort of interpersonal perspective? That's the first question. And the second question, what are you seeing in terms of sort of ESG and sustainability focus as being an emerging topic? There's different schools of thought in relation to that. Thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
I think there's some quite interesting indicators for culture, and depending on the organisation, some of that would be available in the public domain. Some quite interesting research in the UK that talked about the half a dozen things that boards can do to impact the culture. And they're about the appointment of the CEO, like who is it? And the REM structure in the organisation and how closely aligned that is with the values and what are they actually rewarding. And, Qantas is just the most brilliant case study in years to come for AICD. It's ripe for like 20 PhDs I could think of coming out of that, But so some of those things are quite easy because they're publicly available information. But then I guess you have to look at who else is on the board already and what are their backgrounds, and are they all interconnected? Do they all know somebody else? And can you actually draw those spidergrams to link them all? And to make sure that they can answer your questions about why me, what is it in my background that's of interest here? And because there's more disclosure in listed companies, you can look at the attendance of directors. You can look at whether they've had a review. They're supposed to have a review externally every 3 years now. Have they had a review? Were there any findings? How do they assess themselves in terms of skills and experience? Do they have an up-to-date skills matrix? Is it realistic, or is it 10 names, 10 boxes and 98 squares filled in? Or are they actually saying, we've got work to do here? Is there any program for director development? And that will give you another indicator. Are they taking this seriously, or do they just put people on the board and let them hang out to dry? So that, there are sort of few ideas. And just in terms of ESG, yes, there's an interest. I've yet to have an appointment to a board that was purely on the basis of ESG expertise, but it's, I would say, in the last 5 years become much more topical and of much more interest, and people who can do more than mouth the words about ESG but give good examples will I think be valuable on boards. This seem like that.
I'll probably just add that there's a saying, a fish rots from its head. And so with culture, it does come from the board. And so your question is a really good question. And that culture tends to disseminate throughout the organisation. So if you can understand the culture of the organisation, it's probably an indication of actually the culture of the board. A good question. Thanks.
I might just make a couple of comments, probably about the first two questions. In terms of diversity and M&A, at the end of the day, as was said, culture rather than diversity as such is far more important when you start to look at organisations. At the end of the day, you look at all of the business reasons, you look at the markets, you look at a whole lot of things in terms of M&A. But alignment of culture is very important, because when you try and bring businesses together, that alignment of culture really matters. When you talk about diversity, as I said before, you're talking about diversity of skills and thought. And gender is one bastion of that. And so you can't ever forget that and just sort of look at the men and the women. You have to actually understand the stated values and the culture and the makeup of the people and their backgrounds and their thought. So I think that's an important distinction to draw. In terms of culture and ESG, etc., I think that when you do your due diligence to go on a board, you're going to become a member of a team. And so you do all of the reading of the public information you can possibly get, and any private information they're prepared to give you, to understand the values of the organisation, their underlying culture. And you usually get the opportunity to have discussions with existing directors on the board or senior executives. And that allows you to delve into those areas, and you have to make the decision whether the underlying values of that organisation are values that you can support. And I think if that's the case, then you're likely to be far more aligned with them, as long as as well as all of the other business reasons you look for in your due diligence. In terms of ESG and sustainability, it's become a great buzzword. Now, for the last 20 years, I've been a company director, and I've chaired sustainability committees over those 20 years. And I can assure you, with directors' views in terms of the long-term value of the company and what that means, sustainability is the first thing that's on your mind. And sustainability is the 17 UN principles, not just climate change. And I think that you need to ensure you genuinely understand what that word means when you use it.
Thanks, Eileen. We'll go to the next question.
Thanks for today. Yeah, I actually did a PhD on the intersection of corporate governance and corporate responsibility and sustainability. And a lot of that was interviewing board members. And I couldn't help noticing in terms of disciplinary diversity, that wasn't huge. So most people's backgrounds were finance, accounting, law, and maybe engineering. So given that we're in an academic setting here, I have a question around that, and also being in an academic setting, most of us don't have executive backgrounds, and of course that's part of the glass ceiling, isn't it, for women to be able to get the executive roles to then get the board roles. So there's two kinds of challenges there. I'd be really interested to know what you think a person should do if they wanted to build their financial capacity beyond perhaps an AICD course, and the challenge of not having a previous executive role.
Yeah. You're making me think now, because most of my colleagues have come from an executive career. I'm just thinking out loud, some of the things you could be doing is looking for other ways to build those commercial skill sets. So if you're an academic, you could be mentoring startups or businesses and ensuring that you're making a difference to those businesses. It doesn't mean to say you have to work in a business like that, but you could be mentoring or providing advisory services to business. As an academic, I think the risk is that you're, as you sort of were alluding to, become a little insular. Yeah. And so to get out to the real world and spend time with businesses and perhaps offering your services for free to get that experience. And I think businesses would open up their arms and accept that, because you bring a different perspective to the business. And you're not so close to it, and you're not looking at it every day as the management team are. So I think academics have a wonderful opportunity to offer their services to business to gain that experience. And so you don't need to necessarily, what my view is that you don't need to necessarily prove yourself as an executive, but it would be very hard to become a director of an organisation if you've not had some experience, some real world experience, either running an organisation or providing advisory services to organisations and have made a difference to them. So that would be my view on that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's a reality. I mean, I guess my experience with some academics has been, back to Vivian's 3 to 4 pages. I've had 50-page CVs, with listed every paper that's ever been written. I think, board members, many board packs that come in once a month or once every 6 weeks, they could be 300 or 400 pages long. So you need to demonstrate that you can actually read lots and lots of stuff and synthesize it very quickly, but very accurately. And if you can't do that about your own career, I mean, it doesn't actually put you in a great position to be considered seriously to join a board where people are actually trying to be quite cryptic about things, but really cut to the chase of what's the important information. But I think, I think Vivian's point's good. And I think it's probably unrealistic, to be honest, to take a distinguished academic career that has been that and that is very strong on research, albeit that it's research that's related to boards, and think that that's going to be relevant for something like an ASX company, because it might not be, because that's not what ASX companies are about, and making money for shareholders, but looking at other sorts of boards. And so there are lots of boards that you would have things in other parts of your life that I think obviously having a good academic career shows that you've got a terrific ability to think, you can research, you can write, you're intelligent. So they're all ticks, ticks, ticks. But then maybe it's a mutual, maybe it's a private company that's doing something that's allied. And I think many people have an aspiration to be on a big listed company board, whereas many directors that I work with say they're actually the most boring. They're less stimulating than some smaller boards sometimes. That's not a blanket statement. Yep. But a government board, that's looking at regulatory things might be something that's much more aligned with your expertise. So I think looking at the range of boards that's available and trying to get something that's horses for courses, whatever the expression is. Yeah.
I guess from my perspective, I'm a bit of a hybrid. I guess I'm a scientist. I have a PhD in applied maths and statistics, and I started in the academic world, and I did love research, and I've always been involved with research through my whole career, and helping startups and doing all those things. But I moved to a technology role initially in industry, and then moved into management, and I just took on opportunities. I took on profit and loss opportunities if I could manage a P&L line. I did courses in finance. I did a Fulbright scholarship in business. I did all those sorts of things to make my skills balanced. And so I think if that's what you really want, then you've got to do the work.
Yeah, there's no shortcut.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for all of the information you've so openly shared so far. It's been fantastic. There are two parts to my question, but they're related. The first part is actually based on my first and only experience on a board. I shied away from looking for further board positions following that, but I am thinking of a comeback. So the first part to our question was kind of touched on a little bit by Eileen, which was around that due diligence. So if you're invited onto a board, what information should we and what information do we have the right to ask for in order to do a health check on that business? And what might some of the red flags be in terms of good board versus bad board? And the second part, which that leads to, is then around liabilities. So as board directors, you would know there are liabilities. Perhaps you could share a little bit of information on what they are and how to handle that. Thanks.
Eileen, would you like to answer first?
Okay. God, I think if you knew all the liabilities, you wouldn't actually want to be a director. And the fact that I'm an old hand, if I was starting right now in a public listed company, it's not as attractive as it used to be, in the sense that not only is there a lot of onerous responsibilities in the corporations law, but they keep adding them. And sadly, the rule that we had for so long was innocent until proven guilty. Sadly, in this director environment, in a number of areas, in safety and in a whole lot of areas now to do with climate change and to do with a few other areas where they've introduced laws that change the balance, and you're sort of nearly guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. And so you do seriously have to think about the liabilities and understand the nature of the company that you're getting involved in and where their risks lie. In terms of your due diligence, obviously you look at all the public information, but it's talking to people. It's talking to people that might have worked with that company. It's talking to individual directors and senior executives, having questions that you ask them, and trying to have a really extensive look at that organisation and whether it fits with you. As I said, look at the values, Some of the red flags are if the values stated have big things missing that you think are they're important. Well, you know, that could be an issue. If you've got issues in terms of, and you can always ask to speak to the auditors if you've got issues in terms of some of their financial situations and where auditors have placed certain concerns or significant risks. You can talk about that. And I think it's mainly talking to those board members and seeing that you could actually be part of their team, and that as you ask them questions, you're comfortable with the way they answer and the way they think about things. But at the end of the day, anything in this area is risk, and you've got to adjust, you've got to compare the risk to the reward of being involved with that organisation.
And just check they have a D&O insurance.
Yeah, that's right. Which you know, most boards will have, well, all boards should have. But I think back to Eileen's point, you know, it's getting more and more expensive. There are fewer and fewer providers, and that's just a general recognition of the risk environment, which is not going to really get any lighter in years to come. You know, as I've heard said, you know, we have the regulatory environment we deserve. It's you know, regulations have changed, the laws changed following events that haven't gone well, and so what we've ended up with now is very much you know, what the regulators see that we deserve to be in. So that's it. But due diligence, I think, as we've said previously, and then all the public information, and then believe me, directors who are looking at you will be scrabbling around seeing who they know, who might know you, or who's been to school with you, or who is at university in the same year, or who's associated with the same hockey club or whatever. And it's your responsibility to do the same with the directors. As Eileen said, make sure you're very comfortable being part of a team with these members of the team. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh yeah, it may be, as the process goes on, you'd be entitled, once you were down to being very seriously considered, you might be asked to sign a confidentiality agreement, and at that point, either the strategy, if it was a commercial in confidence a document, or their financials, and then usually finally before somebody would join, particularly a listed company board, but others the same way, you would have the right to go and speak to the company auditors to say, can you talk me through last year's accounts, and can you talk me through what the issues are? And those things are very, very normal and part of a standard process. Yeah.
Okay, panel, we have one question online. I'll read it out so everyone can hear it. The recent DCA report on culturally and racially marginalised women in leadership found that only 1.9% of ASX senior execs and less than 6% of board directors are calm women. What novel strategies are boards using to increase representation other than who they know? And I might just add here that it's definitely true. Most of the female directors in Australia and the US have 3 or more directorships because they're getting it through networks. So maybe you can comment on this.
I think what I would like to say is that we just listened to Jane talk about ways that you can get onto a board, and her first one was who you know, and then she went through about a dozen different points. My view is that those points are all very relevant to this question. I do believe that we've covered that, but I'll hand.
Yeah, I do think other administrations have perhaps taken a slightly firmer line on this. So some of the initiatives in the UK and Canada, for instance, and some of the accountability about, you know, where did these directors come from and how were they found? But I think, you know, recent examples in Australia should be a wake-up call to boards that actually there does need to be more attention to a makeup of a board. As I said earlier, you know, a board is a jigsaw and all the pieces have to fit together, but they're all a different shape. And I think we're only scratching the surface of diversity. We are getting more and more requests for young people. There's a much greater interest and only a slightly greater availability of Indigenous board directors to be considered in Australia. People, with lived experience with one. But I do think that boards are waking up, but not every board and not all at the same speed. But if I look back over my career, these issues were very much not really talked about a lot. Whereas for some boards, they're a humbug, but others have just embraced them. And I think some boards take leadership positions, and of course, handled well, then that flows into good business outcomes. And that, I think that's what speaks, at the end of the day in a commercial business.
Yeah, look, I think from my perspective, I come from Newcastle. I'm not any highfalutin networks, I can tell you that. And all of the roles that I've actually got through headhunting firms. And they wouldn't even have known I existed if I didn't actively seek out that role. So I don't really feel like I'm in the club, but I do take being a company director as a professional role. And the fact that I have a number of board roles makes me a better company director on each of the companies that I'm on. And I go across public listed, government and private companies. And I think all of that adds value. And that is my profession, and that is what I do. In terms of really what the underlying issue is, it is that we've put so much concentration on a society of the makeup of boards, and we haven't put enough concentration on women and people of all diverse backgrounds moving through management and having senior management roles and executive roles and chief executive roles. And I'm a member of Chief Executive Women, and I really do think there should be so much more emphasis on that than on the board roles, because the more you do to help that happen in organisations, the more natural feeders there will be into board roles.
I think, unfortunately, time is against us keeping going. When we first started, we said, oh, look, we'll probably go for about an hour, and that's been over an hour and a half, and I'm still ignoring questions in the chat, and I'm sure there's more in the room as well, which just goes to show you the huge interest that this topic has at the practical level of how do boards work and how do I get onto a board, at the level of the need for diversity to improve management and accountability. And I think for the research interests that many of us in the room have as well, we've really heard some great insights into what really happens. I can't thank the industry panellists enough for their time, their energy, the expertise and experience that they've been willing to share with us, and their willingness to field questions from many different parts of the room and of the world of corporate boards, and their willingness to just answer very frankly. So thank you so much, Eileen, on Zoom, and thank you for participating, even though it's been a little bit difficult for you. We'll give Eileen an applause for that.
Thank you.
And in the room, thank you so much to Jane Bridge and to Vivian Quinn for being willing to just share the floor with each other and to bounce off each other and just give us so much. Thank you both so much as well. I do have a small gift from UTS, which I'll make sure you get before you go, to thank you so much for your time. As unfortunately for those on Zoom, you can't participate in this final part. For those who have got a few more minutes, we are going to move down to level 2, where we've got some light snacks if you want to continue the conversations with myself or with Helen or with each other. And thank you so much for your participation today.
Thank you.